Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is Chang-rae Lee. Chang-rae Lee's work is often peopled by characters who don't quite fit in the cultures they find themselves in. They're stories of cultural identity and assimilation, tales of immigrants who both belong and don't belong in two places at once. From his PEN Hemingway Award-winning debut novel, Native Speaker, to his Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Surrender, to the New Yorker's inclusion of Lee, along with such touchstone writers as David Foster Wallace, Michael Chabon, Edwidge Danticat, and Jeffrey Eugenides as the future of fiction, Lee has long been considered a great American writer. That said, not all great writers are household names. If 2013 could be considered the year of George Saunders, the year he went from an admired, acclaimed writer to a cultural phenomenon, when the New York Times Magazine declared you wouldn't read a better book all year than his, perhaps 2014 will be the year of Chang-rae Lee, whose new book, On Such a Full Sea, is being met with similar excitement, so much so that the LA Times asked in its review of the book, who is a greater writer today than Chang-rae Lee? Welcome to Between the Covers, Chang-rae Lee.
Great to be back in Portland.
So, like your books, which often explore this cultural dissonance of immigrants, this belonging and not belonging, your new book belongs and doesn't belong with the previous books in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, it continues a lot of your thematic concerns, but it also is really staking out new territory in terms of genre and form. Do you see it leaning more one way or the other for you? Do you see it more as a continuation or more as a departure?
I think a continuation in the sense that I'm me and I can't help but have a tendency towards certain things, right? It's like a plant towards the sun. You know, it just can't help but turn away. And the kinds of things that I've been interested in before about, you mentioned it, about an individual self and a context around that self and how that context forms that person and influences that person and sometimes defines that person. Those issues were maybe put towards the lens of immigrancy, but I think I've taken that same kind of sensitivity and the same kind of interest towards, and put an entirely different context in this book, a speculative one, which I found really fun to write. Maybe I should amend that. Really fun to think about. Fun to write is not really a notion that is natural to me, because the writing's always a pressured, stressful kind of process. But very fun to think about all the ways in which a radically different and speculative environment could then radically and very differently affect the people inside of it.
So given that this is your first novel that is an immigrant story that takes place in the future, were there dystopian literary touchstones that you went to for inspiration? Is that something that you'd frequently read, or was it just something you decided to go into purely through the process of imagining?
Well, I'd certainly read a lot of the dystopian classics, as we all have as school kids, Orwell's work and Huxley's work and... those are, obviously sort of in my constitution somewhere, but I wasn't thinking about those books, and I wasn't thinking about this book in the terms of the writing of it as quote-unquote dystopian. I really just focused on the kinds of things that I always focus on, which is, what is this place I'm looking at? And, I kind of feel like I've been writing dystopian fictions all along. Because, if you think about the figure of the immigrant, say, coming to a place called New York City or, Queens, and walking around those streets and listening, savoring, hearing the voices, it's sort of like an alien world, right?
I love that quote you gave in a recent interview where you said, all immigrant novels are dystopian novels. They're just not dystopias for most of the readers.
That's right.
That's a great way to look at it, I think.
It really is. And I think that's so true. But this time, of course, the dystopia is the dystopia for everybody. Although, of course, the people inside the story don't feel that it's a dystopia. It's just It's just for us, the reader outside. Inside, the people have all too accepted the world as it is.
Well, let's set the stage of the world building a little for our listeners. There are three types of societies that occur in America of the novel. So can you tell us a little bit about what these societies are?
Yeah, and this is, I'm not specific about the time period, but it's about 150, 200 years from now, not 1,000 years, not 50. And the society is broken down pretty much into three parts. The part that is sort of the central part of the novel is a place called Bmore, and it's the former Baltimore, which comes up, that's why the name is Bmore. And in Bmore, it's a production facility in which they raise indoor tanks of fishes and vegetables. And these are foodstuffs that are meant to be free of contaminants, and they're destined for the rich charter class who live in their own gated communities and can afford such things. So those are sort of two parts of the society, and the charters are, the sort of people that we would consider probably the 1% or the 0.5%, people with a lot of resources, who have had education, who have good health care, who have everything that they really need. And outside the production facility and the charter villages is where really most everyone else lives, and that's called the open counties. And that's a land in which you just might think of sort of an Appalachian type environment where there's really no oversight, there's no government to speak of, there are no laws that people follow,
and certainly no safety net,
and certainly no safety net. So one of the characters that the hero of the story first meets is a fellow who runs a sort of health clinic, but it turns out, of course, he just used to be a veterinarian.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And another big part of the world building is that a lot of the people in the story are actually originally from China. And the place that they're from has become so polluted that they become immigrants to the United States and inhabit abandoned cities in the United States.
Right, and that's what Bmore is. It was repurposed urban decayed land, pretty much, neighborhoods that had been just forlorn and neglected and abandoned. And so all these people came over from China because their own land was poisoned. But they had some, production skills. And, of course, America is a place in which these particular kinds of immigrants were not only welcomed but needed. They need these people to make these foodstuffs for the elite classes.
One way that was really interesting to me was when you think about America and its relationship to its own history, it almost feels like it's always trying to escape it in a lot of ways, say, compared to Mexico, which incorporates its indigenous past into the mythos, into the flag, into the current day narrative. America seems to try to move away from that past. And similarly, it feels to me like the Chinese, when they move here, sort of push out whoever is already there, or at least they become peripheral and marginalized. And I was curious if you saw any parallel between the Chinese and the Americans in their relationship to history.
Well, the Chinese, of course, are deeply interested in their own history. They have one of the richest and longest, recorded histories of any civilization. So in that sense, no. But I think when these settlers come to America, something happens to them, right? I mean, in America, our manifest destiny is always about a frontier. It's not good business to look backwards, and I think that's one of the things that the book has an anxiety about. It has an anxiety about this constant, maybe unsustainable striving that has led the society to break down into these three different parts. And that, so that some people are just merely servicers of those with means, and that those with means, have all these sort of obsessive, neurotic tendencies because they really have nothing else to worry about. So I think it's a peculiarly American gift and kind of flaw that we have.
And so, in a sense, these Chinese immigrants are taking on an American quality when they come to these emptied cities.
Well, yeah, and I pick up the stories of 4 or 5 generations past. So these people are, quote unquote, more assimilated than just being fresh from China.
And what's really interesting about the generations past is, even though this novel is a novel that's taking place in the future. It feels like a past-haunted novel. All the people's backstories are haunting the current day in so many ways, and it's because everyone is displaced. Everyone is essentially an immigrant and is overshadowed by the world that was.
Yes, and overshadowed by the world that is. I mean, I think all the people, even the charters who seem to have everything, and especially, of course, the counties people who have nothing. Each of these groups is highly unsettled in where they are. They each have different issues. The issue that's different for the what the B-Moores face, even though they have kind of a middle class trappings, they have decent enough food and they have some health care, even if it is second rate. But what they don't have is a certain kind of freedom, and I don't just mean political freedom, but they have they've accepted and made a bargain in trading a life of safety for a certain kind of suppression of their destiny. So they know that from the time they're born to the time they die, they'll never leave the walls, and they don't really want to. But there's something soulful that dies in that, I think, and also something about imagination that gets diminished. And that's one of the things that begins to arise in Be-More when one of their own leaves the walls. Her leaving is this audacious act in their view, and they can't help but start to wonder, well, why did she leave us, and what's this place about now?
In case you just tuned in, you're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today with author Chang-rae Lee about his latest novel, On Such a Full Sea. So, Chang-rae, you mentioned the heroine, Fan, and what is really interesting about her, obviously what's unnerving about her in Be-More is her choice to depart from the city. But what's also interesting is you have this grand landscape, you have climate change, you have unexplained disease epidemics, you have the eroding safety net and this major upheaval and translocation of different peoples. And in some ways, the heroine is, obviously her story is a personal story, but it's intimate and modest, and she's actually physically small, and her concerns in some ways are very intimate and modest. It's a quest for love, with this backdrop of this big sweeping upheaval. And I'd love it if you'd talk a little bit about that counterbalance and how you see that functioning in the book.
Yeah. I think normally we assume that the hero or heroine will not just be the swashbuckler, but have this whole raft of philosophical and maybe political, social ideas about what they're doing out in this quest. And that's I think, just typical. But this particular hero, this particular Fan, I just saw her at the start as someone who was outside of all the burdens or the concerns that all the peoples that we've mentioned have. As you say, she's very modest. She only is really just looking for her boyfriend. But the audacity of her act to put herself in danger, and even though she doesn't really report to us about how she feels about that, is enough to inspire all sorts of kind of responses from the people back home in Be-More. They begin painting sort of handmade, painting murals of her and her boyfriend on the walls. They start littering in protest of against some kind of suppression in the community. Some of them even begin shaving their heads in a kind of act of solidarity. Not that she has a shaved head, but so it's really more. She's more almost a mirror to the folks back home in terms of how they're looking out at the world. They look at her. They experience all these different dangers and characters, and they not only they find her captivating because of her bravery, which is again a bravery just of again being there rather than saying or doing something so brave, but they also see how her departure has left a void in their lives, and thus allows them to begin analyzing that void for all the ways in which it's not satisfactory.
Well, I love this quote that you said in an interview around your last book, The Surrendered, that war was the first human story, but it is the aftermath of war where we are truly fascinated. So Homer's Odyssey is the journey after the war. And similarly here, we have both fans' journey after the unnamed upheaval, which we don't ever really fully know how we got to the current day circumstance of the book. But we also have the story being told in the aftermath of her leaving. So it's a very interesting mirroring of the enterprise of The Surrendered in that sense.
Yeah, I'm always interested in aftermath because, when the thing happens, say a crime, an act, some, cataclysmic event, I think it's just overwhelming. We just sort of have to experience it, take it in, and there's this kind of quiet afterwards. But it's in that quiet, I think, that the most interesting questions arise. And that's the response that we put into it, right? That we then interpret it and reshape it by our own very own actions. And so much of this book is not just the following of fans' actions, but in the aftermath of this, kind of condition, but also the very act of telling her story. Is that the narrator, who is a collective narrator from Be More, they seem to be suddenly sort of listening to themselves and refiguring Fan and refiguring her adventures along the lines of maybe what they need and what they want to see.
Well, let's have you read a little bit from the book for our listeners today.
This is about Fan's work. She's a diver in the fish tanks, and so it's a little description of her. Once submerged, a diver is not easily seen. Given all the fish in the water, naturally as many healthy fish are raised as possible, she is a mere shadow among them, trained to do her tasks quickly and unobtrusively. That is why she uses no special breathing apparatus aside from a snorkel, compressed gases causing too much of a disturbance. Fearful fish are not happy fish. The diver is not, quote, one of them, unquote, but is part of the waterscape from the time they are hatchlings, and they see her customary form and the repeated cadence of her movements and the gentle motor of her flippered feet that must come to them like a motherly lullaby, a dream song of refuge, right up to the moment of harvest. The diver is there at harvest, of course, and sees to it that the very last of them finds its way into the chute. And it is only then, for the span of the few hours while the tank is being cleaned and filtered before the next generation of hatchlings is released, that the water is clear of activity, that the diver is alone.
You mentioned just before reading that the narrator is a collective voice, is the first person plural, the we voice. And it's basically the town of Bmore, the middle class society, telling the story of Fan as it unfolds. Tell us about the choice to, this is the other, I would say, big departure for you from your previous books, not just that it's in the future, but this voice that you found, which is really distinct. I would be curious why you chose this voice and what purpose you feel like it serves narratively.
Obviously the most instant and easy choice would have just have Fan describe her own story, tell us in her own words or thoughts what was going on, or have a third person kind of omniscient following her, from above. But I very quickly felt that this novel was also a novel about community, about the ways in which a community functions and self-regulates. And so it seemed really natural once I started using the we, even though it sort of terrified me because you don't see many examples of the we used in fiction. And I didn't quite know where it would lead me, and how long it could sustain itself. But one of the things that began to happen as I used the we was, a certain kind of tonality of the fable began to arise, which I quite liked. And, of course, it's sort of almost an oral tradition, as if we were all sitting around the fire. And also what the we does, and again, this is none of this is planned, but just sort of recognized, during the process, is that when you say the we, you automatically involve the reader, because the reader becomes part of the we, whether he or she wants to be or not. And it's this little tension, that frisson of tension about that I think is quite interesting as we get into the story. So I like that. I like the idea, but ultimately I decided that the we would not be an absolute and consistent voice. That sometimes the we would be unreliable, maybe even confused, maybe almost emotional and hopeful about the things that we were seeing. And so I let it kind of free float from sometimes omniscience to sometimes, intimate psychological kind of expression, to almost sometimes second-person address of the reader, asking the reader to be part of the story and to try to enlist the reader's sympathies. So I sort of feel like, even though it's a we, it's sort of all the points of view.
Well, I think that's what makes this book so unique is, obviously with the we, one of the things you think of is the Greek chorus, and you think of authority, omniscience, and here with the uncertainty and even anxiety of the we, it really is a unique way to enter a book, and it mirrors the middle-class anxiety of the town itself. The town has a very small number of people who would graduate to the charters, and then obviously that has people that are expelled to the open counties. But even the people who are within it, you can tell there's a real suppressed but tangible, palpable anxiety.
Oh, yeah. They have a lot to be worried about. Healthcare, for one, for example. There's quite a bit in the book about how people, because their healthcare is sort of catastrophic healthcare, but not really a very good one, that when they get into trouble, say with some, really serious disease, they can't afford it. And they know they're not going to afford it. And so lots of people are offering themselves to sacrifice themselves so that they won't hurt their families. So there's, that's one of the things that they're worried about. They're worried about, of course, their livelihood. There's a little bit of a boycott during the middle of the book of the fishes and vegetables that they grow, because the charters suddenly think, oh my God, maybe they're poisoned. Maybe they'll give us this disease called C that everyone gets. And that causes a great disturbance in the society. So even though that their society is regulated and their lives are regulated, they're not immune and totally shielded from a lot of, a lot of the concerns that I think, we all have about our lives today.
Well, earlier this year, I read a book by Robert Boswell, his latest, called Tumble Down, and he was attempting to create what he considered a new point of view called unreliable omniscience. And this reminds me of another version of the unreliable omniscience. And I've been thinking a lot about the parallels between the way literature shifts and the way society and philosophy and science shifts. And when you think about the fall of the collective belief in God, and then the decline in the objective and omniscient point of view and narrative, the rise of radical subjectivism and consumer capitalism and hyper-individuated societies, this feels like sort of a grasping out to try to find a way to stitch back together a fabric of the public commons that would resonate, because the pure omniscient, I think, with the journey we've gone through, wouldn't resonate in the same way it would at the time of George Eliot and Tolstoy.
Right. It can't work anymore, because we can peek behind the curtain.
Right.
Through, our knowledge of modernity, psychology, postmodernism.
Exactly.
So it just seems stiff and kind of false. At the same time, psychologically, we distrust the individual voice, because we know all these things have inhabited it and comprised that voice and consciousness. So and just look at the way that our social media works, and the ways in which we all, say on Yelp, we all in a communal voice in a certain way, in an amalgam, decide upon things. It's not perfect by any means, but it certainly is fascinating for all the ways in which manifold voices can become one voice, although that voice, again, is distrusted.
Well, I wonder then if the unreliable omniscience that maybe is a seed of a new trend, like the Occupy movement, could be in a way to try to feel its way towards, trying to bring back something economically that's been lost.
Yeah.
It's interesting parallel at this sort of extreme end of what's going on in the world.
It really is. I mean, I like the way that I didn't know about the Boswell book, but it seems to make a lot of sense to me. Is that we both? It seems authentic and clear-sighted as much as we would accept something authentic and clear-sighted.
Sure.
Right. And that's the constant tension in our world now. We want to believe, but it's so hard to.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Chang-rae Lee about his novel On Such a Full Sea. Let's talk a little bit about the title. It has two meanings, and I'm not going to reveal what one of them is because it happens somewhat far into the book. But one of them is included in the epigram from Shakespeare,
right,
from Julius Caesar. Can you talk a little bit about how you chose the title and how it relates to this play?
Sure. First of all, I had a terrible time finding a title for this novel, and I just happened to be reading Julius Caesar, which I'd read before a long time ago, and it's one of the great plays of his. And then I came across what is a very famous speech by Brutus to Cassius about a kind of precarious or dangerous moment, and seizing the opportunity in that moment to move forward and to cause change and positive change. He's speaking metaphorically, of course, but on such a full sea are we now afloat. But those words, the words themselves, I thought had a wonderful ring to it, as a lot of Shakespeare does. He's very reliable as a titleist, but also it seemed to capture perhaps the figure of Fan quite well for me. That she's the only one in this precarious and fragile society who's putting herself in the position, situating herself in such a way that not that she's going to lead anybody, but that she's going to mark out some kind of path through this wilderness. And that to me was quite inspiring. And also there's a lot of water imagery in the book, and of course Brutus is speaking metaphorically, but I like the fact that she's a diver and that she's kind of going into the depths of the deep and profound problems of this new society.
I was curious if Moby Dick was another influence, not just because of the water and fish themes, but also as another book that deals with American consumerism and capitalism and the obvious downside of the monomania of that. But also you have a couple characters, Quig and Star, and I wondered if they were Queequeg and Starbuck. Is that am I reading too far?
Well, you're not reading all that far too far. I think whenever you have a Q character in an American fiction, I think you have to think about Queequeg. But yeah, I mean. And also the figure of the whale, right? I mean, the whale is it's sort of a way that all the characters can write themselves into the landscape, right? Into the destiny of that story. The whale itself it has, of course, no consciousness. It's the consciousness and presence that it's given is all by those who look around it. And I don't want to try to elevate or make anything grandiose, but Fan is sort of the same character. She's elemental, and there's something about her that's both kind of absent, but absent of a kind of human consciousness in the ways that we normally get human consciousness in a maximal way in a fiction. But also she's, I don't know, a kind of canvas that we all want to write on, at least the people in Be More do. And so I, there was something about that, about her elemental quality that is probably a little Melvillian.
And I know when you were on the New Yorker fiction podcast, you chose to read a short story by Don DeLillo. Mm. Do you see DeLillo in this book in any way?
Well, there's one of my favorite DeLillo books, and a lot of people's favorite DeLillo books is White Noise. And that's a book that I really enjoy. It's about a lot of things: consumerism again, kind of American storytelling through this deadened language of commerce. But it's also, it also is filled with this kind of, these waves in radiation and an airborne toxic event that is just this kind of this ominous atmosphere, literally over the landscape. That we're infected by our society in ways that we just can't quite grasp. And if we could grasp it, would be horrified, right? And DeLillo expresses that. And I always felt that book was a slightly dystopian novel, even though it's comic, of course, and satirical. So it's not realistic, but it shows a world in which all those kind of levers that are being pushed and pulled through language and advertising and all that kind of stuff are exposed so that we can really see it. And once we really see it, we're terrified.
You once said that your first 3 books you felt were more cerebral than the 4th, The Surrendered, and that The Surrendered relied more on something visual, that it relied more on the power of images. And I was curious how you would fit on Such a Full Sea in that. Do you feel like it is more visual also, or how does it stand out or fit in with your books in that regard?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's... The narrator of On Such a Full Sea is just as cerebral and self-interested as the narrators of those first 3 books in a different way. And because it's it's hard we don't specify it and make it a discrete personality, but it is a personality full of all those anxieties we've been talking about. But it's an anxiety that, it's a personality that is completely entranced by image and all the things that Fan sees. And Fan's really the eyes and ears of the we. That's their reach into the world. And without her, they'd have nothing. They couldn't possibly see anything, and they allow her to imagine and have a freedom of imagination that they could never have before. So I think this book is a little bit of both those kinds of urges and perspectives.
And it has that ever-evolving mural as a plot point in it as well.
Yes, yeah. And there's a lot of drawing and storytelling. There's a lot of not art per se being produced, but the urge for an artistic kind of expression and action. And that's something that in the book, for me, almost is a political idea. Obviously the society is riven by lots of deep issues and problems, but what's the response? I don't have any political responses inside the book. The only political response is this artistic urge that begins to rise up.
Which is really also an assertion of a certain type of individuality. I
think so, yeah. And an assertion that we only become individuals when we have that creative urge. Mm-hmm. That we're not just consumers. We're not just surviving. That's our gift as humans. It's not just about survival. It's not just about being comfortable. I think the book is worried that all those things are now perfectly acceptable definitions of being human. And it says, no, it's not. And Fan is the only thing that really inspires that kind of urge, that other urge for, a different kind of creation.
Do you have any books of the immigrant experience that are touchstones for you, or fundamental books for you in becoming a writer?
Well, yeah, a couple. One of them is a book that people don't really know about, is by Carlos Bulosan, a Filipino-American writer, called America's in the Heart. It's somewhat a sentimental novel, but full of kind of really searing scenes about just injustice and racism. But his, as I think you can tell by the title, America's in the Heart, there's such poignancy of his feeling for this land, even as it is mistreating him and not seeing him. And there's something about that book that I just find deeply emotional and satisfying.
And do you have a sense of what your next project's going to be?
I don't like to talk about it so much, but I think it's also kind of Asia-inflected. I've been traveling through Asia a lot, and I really feel as if Asia, and for a while it's been the case, but Asia is really this dynamic force in world affairs, a newer one, but in continuing to, its rise to culturally and politically and economically, influence what we know here in the West. And so I'm again probably going to follow some characters, maybe in a more traditional picaresque mode,
interesting,
and have a lot of fun with it.
Do you have a sense of point of view or future versus realist?
I do, and it's going to be set now, but I think it'll be a little bit fantastical and magical
That's
at
great.
the same time.
Well, it was a pleasure having you on Between the Covers today, Chang-rae.
Thanks a lot. It was great.
We're talking today with Chang-rae Lee, the author of On Such a Full Sea. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host.